All right, we are live with Alexander Mercouris in London, and we are very honored to have with us Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Professor Sachs, thank you for joining us on the Duran. I have
Great to be with you.
It's a pleasure to have you with us. I have your information where you can follow Professor Sachs in the description box down below, and I will also add it as a pinned comment when the live stream is over. So definitely follow Professor Sachs and everything that he is writing about with regards to what is happening in the world. And we have a lot going on. So a quick hello to everyone that is watching us on all of the platforms. And thank you to our moderators in the chat. Thank you for keeping everything running. Alexander, Professor Sachs, let's talk about what is happening in the world.
Let us indeed, and who better to discuss all of this whole situation than Professor Sachs. Professor Sachs, who understands international relations, who knows the region very well, who can talk to us about the economic consequences of this war for the region and for the world. Professor Sachs, let's begin straight with what is in some ways, I think, the single most important thing. President Trump talks about this being in some ways a war for necessity. He speaks about this being a war that must be fought. I find this extraordinarily difficult to understand. We had negotiations ongoing. The negotiations seem to be succeeding. The Yemeni mediators were happy. The Iranians were making concessions. What is the moral, legal foundation for this war? Is there one? And if there is no such foundation, what conclusion can we draw?
Well, good morning to both of you and everybody. This is the ultimate war of choice, the ultimate war that never should be, never had to be. This is the war of Bibi's choice, decided 40 years ago in Bibi's fervid imagination, but also this is a U.S. Deep state war as well, with everything amplified by a mentally unstable president, to just put it bluntly. What do I mean by this? Well, first of all, there was no cause of war. Iran was not threatening the United States or Israel. In fact, it was virtually begging for negotiations over the past 2 years, even after the first time of negotiations last June was interrupted by a U.S.-Israeli war. So the Iranians wanted negotiations rather fervently, and I met twice in the past 2 years with President Pezeshkian when he came to the United Nations. His entire remarks on both occasions were about peace, the desire for peace, the absolute insistence that under religious doctrine, under the fatwa of the late supreme leader, the one assassinated by Israel, they did not want nuclear weapons. They had already signed off against nuclear weapons. They just did not want to be attacked and overthrown the way that Israel and the United States are attempting today. So basically, this is not a war that came because of any exigency, any pressing matters, certainly not in any conceivable way a war that is legal under the UN Charter. Article 51 allows for the use of force in the event of self-defense of an armed attack. Of course, there was nothing remotely like that in the context of the Israeli-US attack here. So what is going on? Well, the first point to emphasize is that the United States and Israel never wanted a negotiated outcome with Iran. Not last year, not this year, and not during the past decade. How do we know that? Because they had one when President Obama negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, in 2015, an agreement between Iran and the P5 members of the Security Council, the US, UK, France, China, Russia, plus Germany, so the P5+1, and then ratified immediately, unanimously by the UN Security Council. There was an agreement for Iran to be under strict UN supervision, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to make sure that what Iran was saying, and what it was saying repeatedly for decades, that it did not want a nuclear weapon, that its energy program was not for a nuclear weapon, was in fact the case. Now, important to know, under the JCPOA, Iran was in strict compliance. There was absolutely no sense in which what happened in 2018 was because of Iranian actions. What happened in 2018 is Donald Trump tore up the JCPOA. He said, we're not going to be party to it. We're not going to be party to an agreement not only duly reached and being implemented, but one that was unanimously adopted by the United Nations Security Council. Why did he tear it up? Well, his buddy Bibi Netanyahu told him to. Trump since then, and Netanyahu since then, have been in active delusion that they would simply overthrow the Iranian government, never wanting to negotiate. I had a very strange, unpleasant interaction with one of the U.S. negotiators last year when I thought I could be a little bit helpful to make a suggestion or two, because I thought there were actual negotiations going on, and I was extraordinarily rudely brushed off, and that was the last time I tried to make any informal suggestion about how to move forward. And it was clear to me from then something so weird is going on, because this was before the bombing last June. But it was absolutely clear how completely strange things were. There was no attempt at negotiation. Now, all of this became clear. I had to make one correction to what I've been saying. I've been saying for years that Iran is being targeted by Israel for 30 years. And I emphasize 30 years because 30 years ago, a political doctrine of Netanyahu and his American political advisors called clean break was issued as Netanyahu became prime minister of Israel. So I said this is a 30-year attempt to overthrow Iran. I stand corrected, because Netanyahu himself has made clear that even for 10 years before that, when he wasn't prime minister, it was also his dream. He's actually posted that this war is a 40-year dream. So that means it's not exactly driven by the events at the negotiating table, whether Iran was negotiating in good faith, whether what was happening with the Omani mediator was working. And of course, we also have to appreciate that the Omani mediator said extremely clearly the negotiations are proceeding. They were essentially a fake, a cover for a 40-year dream. Now, having said that, let me put this in context. I'll start 30 years ago with clean break. Clean break is the prevailing doctrine of the Israeli right wing, which runs the country with a lot of broad support, I should say. So it's not the case in the United States that Netanyahu doesn't have support for his violence. It's more widespread in Israel. Clean break was the doctrine that said there would never be a state of Palestine. and that the way to ensure that there would never be a state of Palestine in the two-state solution would be not to resist the militants such as Hamas that were fighting for a Palestinian state, but rather to take down every government in the Middle East, and I should add, in Africa, that supported the Palestinian cause. And this actually built on earlier Israeli doctrines, extreme militaristic doctrines called the periphery doctrine, which is side with the countries in Africa or the Middle East that are non-Islamic if they can find them. So Christian countries or places with some Christian populations to fight the Islamic majority states, and especially those that support Palestine. So the foreign policy of Israel has been a policy to overthrow governments in the Middle East that support the Palestinian cause, with the ultimate objective being Greater Israel. Greater Israel is an ideological doctrine of right-wing Zionism, which says that Israel controls all of the land of what was once Palestine under the British mandate. But for many of these zealots, especially the biblical literalists in Jewish Zionism and in Christian Zionism, much bigger, in fact, than mandatory Palestine. But as the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, said a couple of weeks ago, in his interpretation of Genesis 15, Israel's rights extend from the great river of Egypt to the great river of Mesopotamia, the Euphrates. Okay, this is all mind-boggling. But let me come back to the main point. The main point is that since 1996, it has been Netanyahu's political doctrine to overthrow governments across the region that support the Palestinian cause. That's amazingly what this is about from Israel's point of view. The reason that the U.S. goes along with this has many potential threads and explanations. We can come back to that. Of course, part of it is the Zionist lobby in the United States, no doubt. Part of it may be blackmail under the Epstein files and that kind of thing. But part of it also is a U.S. doctrine of global hegemony that fits well together with the Israeli doctrine of regional hegemony. So it's not simply Israel telling the U.S. what to do, but the U.S. neocons, who are tightly linked, of course, with the right-wing Zionists, have a global doctrine in which Israel's clean break doctrine fits well, that Israel will be the agent or the partner in ensuring hegemony in the Middle East as part of a U.S. absolute doctrine to have global hegemony. Okay, so we're in something that's very long-term. It has a couple peculiar features to it. One is that both the leader of the United States and of Israel are old, very sick men. They are mentally deranged. That's not a political judgment I'm making. It's my best guess, listening to lots of psychologists and psychiatrists about the actual state of affairs. They are both megalomaniacs, and again, not in a kind of a political cartoon sense, but I think in an actual clinical sense. They are extreme narcissists, and my view is that they're psychopaths, which is also a clinical condition, meaning a lack of remorse or sympathy for victims. And Trump seems to display this in massive extent. So you have an underlying political doctrine in two countries, U.S. global hegemony, Israeli regional hegemony for the sake of greater Israel. You have two leaders who are old, corrupt, unhinged. And this, to my mind, is the basic reason that we have this dreadful, dangerous, disastrous war underway. One final point, if I may say it, and then back to you. The clean break doctrine has been implemented by Israel and the United States for 30 years. So this is not a hypothetical. This is the actual implementation. And General Wesley Clark, who was the NATO Supreme Commander under Bill Clinton, told us after 9/11 about the application of this doctrine when he visited the Pentagon soon after 9/11, that's back in 2001. He was shown a document that said that the United States would engage in 7 wars in 5 years. The idea was to remake the Middle East. This was, in effect, the post 9/11 application of clean break. The 7 wars were Libya, Sudan, Somalia, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. We've had all 7 wars now. It wasn't 5 years. We know from inside testimony that they chose as the first of those 7 in West Asia the attack on Iraq in March 2003. They expected that to be a walkover, and then they would continue on with the rest of the wars. But that one proved not to be a walkover. The U.S. got bogged down in the local civil war and violence for many years. And so they didn't reach Iran soon afterwards as they expected. But the fact of the matter is that all of the wars have now taken place. Libya was overthrown by brazen regime change operation in 2011. Sudan was destroyed by a heavily Mossad-led and supported insurrection by South Sudan that broke Sudan in 2. Now we have 2 civil wars, one in Sudan and one in South Sudan. Of course, Lebanon is in active destruction and Israel is invading again as we speak. Syria, the overthrow attempt began in 2011. Notice that Obama, our nice president, was leading the Libya and the Syrian wars. This is across all these presidencies. It doesn't really matter exactly who's president. But the Syrian overthrow was expected to be quick in 2011. It turned into a 14-year protracted, deadly war in which hundreds of thousands of people died. But that was a CIA-led operation called Operation Timber Sycamore. And Iran was the great prize. Iran is something different from all the rest. It's nearly 100 million people. It's a powerful country. Anyone who has read Herodotus, and I hope some people have, know that these issues with Iran or Persia go back thousands of years. This is a great civilization. This is not Lebanon, if I may say so, or some post-World War I construction. And so Iran was the hard case. Iran has its own long history, by the way, because Britain and the United States subverted Iran back in 1953, which was part of the long, sad saga of how the Western world has desired to wreck Iran throughout the 20th century. But having said that, they couldn't quite get to Iran until now. So this is two old, destabilized, mentally imbalanced individuals leading two militaristic states, working side by side, not one wagging the other, but both working in partnership for their respective dreams of hegemony. Bottom line, this has nothing to do with choice. This is pure imperialism of the most vulgar and dangerous kind.
Professor Sachs, thank you for that masterly discussion. Now, I have a few points of my own to make, and they're partly derived from what you've said here and what you said in other places, because you've been active discussing this issue. Also, what your friend Michael Schulenberg, by the way, has been saying too. And I'd like to start briefly with something which has disturbed me greatly. Firstly, that if we talk about the attack on Iraq, in the United States, Congress was consulted. The United Nations Security Council was consulted. Of course, the United Nations Security Council, its concerns were ultimately ignored, but it was consulted. The UN Charter makes it very clear that war can only be conducted in self-defense and preferably with the authority, in fact, ultimately always with the authority of the Security Council itself, which is the institution created to preserve peace. Now, none of this has happened this time. There's been no attempt to consult Congress in the United States. There's been no attempt to consult the Security Council. The attack took place, as you say, in the midst of negotiations. The other side, Iran, was making concessions. The Imani negotiators were talking about a further meeting in Vienna. The United States itself was giving indications that it would be going to that meeting. This is cynicism taken to the most extreme level. There was no proximate threat from Iran. The president of the United States had previously said many times that the attack the United States carried out on Iran back in June had destroyed its nuclear program. Well, he might have been overstating things, but that's what he said. To me, this is not just a war of choice. That word, that expression, war of choice, makes me concerned. What this was a war of aggression.
Yes.
Or so it seems to me. And if you go back to the Nuremberg hearings, which are the foundation of modern international law, it is clearly said that wars of aggression are the worst form of crimes against peace. Crimes against peace are the supreme crime from which all other crimes come, these international war crimes come. And of course, the jurists who formulated these ideas included Joseph Jackson, who was the chief prosecutor. He was a member of the Supreme Court of the United States. He wrote a letter to President Truman, and President Truman came to the General Assembly of the United Nations and said, we in the United States are going to be forever bound by this. We accept this, we formulated it, it applies to us to the same degree as it applies to everyone else. No one is talking about this. Where are the protests that at least we had on the eve of the conflict in Iran against Iraq? There was a small protest of perhaps a few thousand people in London, nothing comparable to the kind of protests that took place then. Is it because we've had so many wars for all of these extraordinary, and I have to say what you described, I mean, the ultimate strategy, the strategic purpose behind this war, the clean break idea, concepts of hegemony. I mean, not only are these grotesque and unrealistic and inhuman taken to the extreme, but they underline the extent to which this is a war of aggression. I mean, wars conducted for those kind of objectives are by definition wars of aggression. But have we become so accustomed to these wars now that we allow these things in the West to take place, and we have given up to a degree that I find incredibly concerning and very dangerous? We've given up pushing back or protesting against them. Not all of us, yourself, obviously. You've been a powerful and eloquent voice, one that many, many people listen to. But I don't get the sense of energy and opposition that I once did.
I agree with every word you said, and I want to underscore one of the words I think you said is grotesque. The aims are grotesque. This is Israel with around 10 million people wanting to assert control over hundreds of millions of people. It's the United States with around 340 million people wanting to assert control over 8.1 billion people. Nothing less than that. So these are not only wars of aggression, they are wars of blatant and brazen imperialism. We're watching very old-fashioned imperialism. They are reminiscent of the 19th century. The point was, it had been for the world that World War II was so devastating, so horrific, and the nuclear age was so dangerous that this would not be allowed to happen again. It's not that we haven't seen wars of aggression before, and we had brazen imperialism by Europe and the United States for centuries. But the idea was that we had learned something. And the preamble of the United Nations Charter says this is to end the scourge of wars that have twice visited humanity in the 20th century. So what we are witnessing is the unlearning of what we had learned. We have no instincts in Europe or the United States, and certainly none whatsoever in Israel, which lives in the 4th century BC by many of its leaders, not, or 5th century BC. I shouldn't even be so generous as 4th century BC. This is brazen imperialism, and it raises many questions, of course. But for me, it raises the question, is there still a constitutional republic in the United States? And it's a very interesting question, I think a lot about, because we have the paradigm, the paradigmatic case of the Roman Republic becoming the Roman Empire, traditionally dated to 27 BC, when Octavian declared himself Augustus and Princeps. This was the date usually given for the end of the Roman Republic. But what's very interesting, in fact, is two things. One, the trappings of republicanism in Rome continued after what we now call the start of the Roman Empire, because the Senate still met, they still wore their togas, they still had consuls and magistrates. And to someone living at that time, they might not have said, oh, now we're an empire. We once were a republic. This was a continuation, not an event. And secondly, 27 BC the traditional date after Augustus defeats Mark Antony and so forth and declares himself princeps was itself a gradual process that goes back throughout the 1st century BC with Sulla, Pompey, the triumvirate, Julius Caesar, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, the point is the US has slid into empire for sure at some point. We have the trappings of constitutional republicanism, but when it comes to foreign policy, we are not a republic. We're not governed even by the sense of law. And when the Senate was asked itself last week, do we want to have anything to do with it? They didn't say, well, under Article 1 of our Constitution, it's our job to declare war. They said, no, thank you. We don't want to get involved in this. This is something for the emperor. This isn't something for us. So we're already in that mode of behavior. Of course, we've seen this for decades. The imperial presidency has been noted for decades. When did it really begin? Well, clearly it's a post-World War II phenomenon. 1947, it was a kind of clean break for us. This is when the CIA was established. That created the mechanisms for US post-World War II imperialism. In January 17, precisely 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was our most celebrated general, the supreme commander of Allied forces in World War II, and then later the president, issued a stark warning that the military-industrial complex was threatening the US democracy. We used to read that as a warning about the future. I now read it as a statement of the time about the existing reality that Eisenhower was telling us we've been taken over. And I think we need to reread that. Arguably, just like you could date the decisive turn of Rome in 44 BC with the murder of Julius Caesar, arguably you could say that the American empire came into full force on November 22nd, 1963 with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which I think overwhelmingly likely was a CIA operation and was empirically the last time that a president stood up to the military-industrial state. So it is, in my view, not shocking that we see these wars of choice. They've been true all through my career. The brazenness of this is something different, as you note. There's not even an attempt at an excuse. There's not even an attempt at any kind of process. The American people are completely against this. Why is this? Two reasons. One, we have slid into imperial behavior over decades, and so all of the real institutions of control were long ago pushed aside. But second is the particular personality of Donald Trump, a dark triad personality of megalomania, malignant narcissism, and psychopathy. This is something different. You should not have a person like this as president. This is especially of such a powerful country. This is extremely dangerous. So we have this mix, but the underlying reasons is the erosion of the most basic constitutional checks. After all, I have to point out from a juridical point of view, the UN Charter is not only something that the US subscribes to, it is the law of the land. It is a treaty duly ratified by the United States Senate in July 1945, which under our Constitution makes it the law of the land. But we hear little of the Constitution. The Supreme Court, thank God, rallied a few weeks ago and said Trump can't set the whole trade regime. That's unconstitutional. That was a glimmer of light. But when it comes to foreign policy, sadly, those same 9 justices I don't want to put words in their mouth, God forbid, but would likely side with the imperial presidency. Why does Europe have not a word about this? Well, this is what we've been asking for years. How did Europe become a complete vassal of the United States, which it is? And it is a little hard to understand. Partly it's the selection of the leaders, which have to go through the US approval mill or they get pushed aside easily. Partly it is simple mechanics. If you have US military bases on your soil, you are an occupied country, whether you like it or not. You have the CIA there, you have subversion, you have US direct political interference. You are a semi-occupied country. But I have to just tell you how shocking it is to hear this. I was at the UN Security Council last week. I had been invited to testify about the war, and then the UK and the US blocked me from testifying. And this is par for the course. That's the least of it. But as I listened, of all people, the Danish ambassador launched into a tirade against Iran on the day that the US and Israel attacked Iran. She couldn't mention that Iran had been bombed or that 150 schoolgirls had been murdered or that this was a violation of the UN Charter, an unprovoked attack by Israel and the United States. She didn't even mention that. She just went into a tirade against Iran. This is the one that someday will turn to the UN and say, how can you not help us with Greenland after the United States has invaded her country? I went up to her afterwards to have a word. I wanted to point out that this is not safe for Denmark. She looked up from her notes, looked at me, turned around and walked away. I called after her, could I have a word with you? Walked away. And so this is the state of affairs in our world today. Europe is useless. We know it. We bemoan it every day. Useless. Not a voice of sanity, except for Pedro Sanchez. Let's champion him because he's been very brave. And President Connolly of Ireland, who knows about this. But for the rest of Europe, nothing right now on this point. And so the US and Europe don't uphold the learnings of World War II or the law of the international community in the UN Charter. We've lost the reflexes for that. And sorry to ramble on, but in 2003, many European countries, and I remember walking across the green with Dominique de Villepin, who had just spoken at the UN Security Council. France objected to the US-Iraq war. Wonderful. We don't hear a voice like that in a major European country now.
No, we don't. Let's talk about Iran, because my own clear sense is that there's been very little understanding of that country. There were a lot of assumptions that this war was going to end very quickly. There's been a universal belief among Western leaders that the government is not only unpopular, but illegitimate in some way, never exactly explained, that the course of the war has come as a terrible surprise, that nobody expected that it would have dragged on in the way that it has. And you are starting to see in the media, certainly here in Britain, what you might call the worm of doubt. People are asking, is this going to go on for a long time? Is this going to turn out well? What if it doesn't? What if we've underestimated Iran? What if we've underestimated the strength of its institutions and its armed forces and its level of economic and social cohesion? Well, if they have underestimated all of those things. That really does argue again about their planning, their quality of planning being completely wrong, because as you say, they've been thinking about doing this for years, decades. They should have a very clear understanding of Iran, and it seems that they don't. I mean, is that also your perception? I mean, it's certainly mine that they really don't understand Iran, perhaps because they've fallen in with these grotesque ideas of domination of the Middle East, domination of hegemony, domination of all sorts of things. And one of the things I've learned in my life is that people who lose touch with reality on one thing eventually lose touch with reality on everything. Is that what the problem is?
I have a general principle which I've tried to get instated for many, many years, which is that the United States should not be allowed to bomb any country unless more than half the U.S. population can name 2 cities in that country. This would end all American wars. Americans know nothing about Iran. And that includes our leadership. Of course, I'm being jocular. We should not be bombing other countries, period. But the ignorance is beyond imagining. Donald Trump, of course, knows zero about everything. Everything. The man is a complete, total ignoramus. And that is not my testimony. That is what I hear from leaders around the world that deal with him. He's simple-minded, and this is also extraordinarily concerning. No, they don't have a plan. They don't have a strategy. They are relying basically on an old CIA failed ploy, which is get the U.S. into something and then escalate as needed. So that's not a military strategy. If it could take us back again 64 years to another CIA concoction, which was the invasion of Cuba, the Bay of Pigs in April of 1961. They had no plan, but Allen Dulles thought once we get people on the ground and if they get under attack, Kennedy will have to call in air cover and we will be in a full-fledged invasion of Cuba. Now the plan is we'll escalate as needed. That's why Trump talks about now openly, well, we're going to have to put soldiers in. We're going to have to put the boots on the ground, as it's called. I don't think this is going to happen, by the way, because the United States public is so much against this, at least 3-1 against it, and it's going to go to much longer, stronger opposition very, very soon as people see how completely reckless, violent, boneheaded all of this is. But the answer to the question is they do not have a plan. Netanyahu's plan is get the U.S. involved. Those who favor this have the plan that once we're involved, we'll just escalate as necessary. The whole thing is a complete concoction and debacle. And the best evidence of that is the market judgment, because that's a kind of summary of those who are whose money is directly at stake. Today, oil prices have soared well above $100 a barrel by some quotes that I saw just in the few minutes before we started, up to about $120 a barrel. Oil is on the route to doubling in price over this very early stretch from the pre-war price until today. It's not quite there yet, but it's headed there. This is an economic calamity, but the point is that those who put their money down in bets, and the market bet on energy is the cleanest and clearest of this bets, is that we have a disaster unfolding.
Let's talk about that, because you're perhaps the best person to discuss this. $120 a barrel oil We have already a very difficult economic situation in Europe altogether. In Germany, they've been talking about deindustrialization. In Britain, there's a strong sense of economic malaise. In every Western country, people's living standards are under very, very great stress. $120 a barrel oil. What is that going to do to the world economy now, especially if this shock continues very long? And did the people who made the proximate decisions to start this now, did they not realize that this might happen? I mean, it was so likely that it would happen. How could they miss it? But tell us first of all about what are the possible outcomes. And by the way, before you do, can I just point to people what a prescient economic commentator you are in some respects? I remember when Trump brought in the tariffs, you said that the tariffs would not reduce the American trade deficit. They didn't, just to say. So given that kind of exemplary track record, what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, if I could just say on the tariffs very briefly, I said A, they're illegal, brazenly illegal. B, they wouldn't reduce the trade deficit. 3, they wouldn't create manufacturing jobs, which on our February report are down 100,000 jobs from last year to this year. The whole thing is so incredibly imbecilic. Okay, I'll put that aside.
Yeah.
On this one, you know, this is weird, but my PhD dissertation 46 years ago was on oil shocks. It was doing the first modeling of the oil shocks of 1973-74 and 1979-80. And I wrote the first book about that, the economics of worldwide stagflation, published in 1982. So I've been thinking about this for decades, actually. The fact of the matter is this is an extremely, extremely serious shock to the world economy. It is likely to be prolonged. Of course, we're in the very first days, so things can change, but it doesn't seem like the U.S. is backing down, and it does seem like the energy facilities of the Gulf region and Iran are being destroyed or heavily damaged. And one country after another is shutting in its production because you can't produce if you can't store or ship. And they can do neither right now. So we're seeing soaring oil prices. We're seeing another important indicator, the volatility of the stock market soar once again. That's called the VIX index. That is also a predictor of a serious economic crisis. So I believe we're entering into a worldwide economic crisis this year. When it happened in the 1970s, output relative to trend, in other words, taking into account that world output has an underlying upward trend, and then comparing where things were a year after the oil shock from where they were would have been expected to be, the downturns in both 73, 74 and 79, 80 were on the order of 4 or 5% of world output relative to trend. Very sizable shocks, a lot of economic pain, a lot of unemployment. I think we're heading for that right now. Of course, things can change. These are early days, but at least as of the past few days, those who really are watching in minute detail what's being blown up, what production is stopping, what the chances of the U.S. military opening the Strait of Hormuz and so forth, what they're telling us is this is a very, very serious economic crisis lying ahead. And I think that it comes in the context of a lot of weakness in the US already. The jobs declined in February. They've basically been stagnant or in decline for several months. Europe is in persistent crisis in a very weak state across Europe. So I would expect that this would mean a downturn in both the United States and Europe this year. Trump being insane, actually. Oh, so oil prices will go up. So it's the price we have to bear. The voters will have a different idea very soon. This will be true across Europe. There is revulsion at the political class in Europe. There is revulsion of Trump. And we need to remember, these are the people we see strutting on the stage. They are not liked. They are not popular. They are not following public opinion whatsoever. And occasionally, rarely, but occasionally, the public gets a say in this, and the say is not going to be a happy one. Of course, all of this depends on U.S. ballots actually being counted in November, which is going to be another drama coming up.
We're just having an election, by the way, in Baden-Württemberg in Germany, and the early reports are that the CDU has lost ground significantly and might lose the state. So anyway, we'll see. Is there any way back? Is there any way out of this mess? I mean, I have to say that the idea of sending in the US Navy to provide escorts to tankers.
Yes, it's a delusion on a delusion on a delusion.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen. So, I mean, what can be done? Because the other great change in the world is that the United States does not have the overwhelming monopoly over power that it did, say, 30 years ago. There are other very, very big players now. There's China, where Donald Trump is supposed to go at the end of this month. There's Russia, of course. There's India, too. There's all sorts of countries. One gets the sense that none of them are happy. What might happen? Might we actually see an international movement to end this war outside the West? That would be something very new if it were to be effective.
Yes, there will be a world rising demand to end the war as the economic pain hits. And that economic pain is going to hit quite quickly in prices, of course, for petrol and diesel, and in electricity costs, and in other ways. So it won't take that long for the pain to be widely felt. This is one point. That will cause politicians to scramble. What do we do? How do we survive? What do we say to our publics? The way that this war ends, and the only way, in my view, that it ends, is that the United States and Israel stop their war of aggression, period. I don't think it's going to end at the negotiating table. I don't see what the negotiations would be about. I don't see there being a possibility of negotiating right now, but there is absolutely the possibility that Israel and the United States stop the attack. Of course, that is a loss of face. Who gives and I won't say it, but basically, who could care that Trump and Netanyahu lose face? Despicable people who went against the world good. Of course they should lose face. They're disgraceful. We need the fighting to stop. It could stop if there is a crescendo of voices for it to stop. That crescendo will not start in Europe because they don't even have a voice that they know how to utilize right now. But even that will come later. the voices have to start with where you absolutely indicated, and that is with the BRICS countries. China and Russia, of course, are allies of Iran. They're supporting Iran. The idea that, oh, they're giving intelligence, are you kidding? Why not? This is also a U.S. war directed against Russia and China, have no doubt about it. This is world hegemony at stake. Of course, they are going to give material support, financial support, military support, probably not direct troops, but a lot of other kinds of support. Of course, that's going to happen. But diplomatically, what I find most interesting is India. India, to my mind, is actually the decisive factor in this right now. Sad to say, India plays two roles, one of them completely erroneous for India, and the other very important. The erroneous role is India thinking that it will replace China as America's supplier, and that it will reap benefits as together with the United States and Israel against, with the United States against China and Israel as a provider of military technology and intelligence technology. So India has sidled up to the United States despite all the abuses, and it hasn't really ended that. Modi was in Israel a few days ago. For God's sake, what the heck is that? And there's also, there's other considerations, but that's one side. The other side is India should remember that its colonization by the British Empire wasn't a great party. It was a disaster. And the same with the United States. To become a vassal of the United States, to play with the United States in the Quad, to suffer a calamitous energy crisis because India is completely energy import dependent from the Middle East because of a U.S.-Israeli war of imperialism is not what India wants. So India has the presidency of the BRICS this year. If India, Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa, the African Union, Egypt, Ethiopia, all stand up and say, this is outrageous. And if Europe, God help us, would follow Pedro Sanchez and say, this is not good for us, actually, the fighting will stop. After that, I think the consequences will be extremely significant. Of course, the U.S. will have been exposed, as exactly Kissinger's adage has it, to be a friend of the United States is fatal. This will be proved yet again. I don't think Israel can continue in this mad, violent way after this. It will have created a worldwide crisis, not just a regional crisis. I think Israel, if it continues in this way, should be expelled or suspended from the UN, as South Africa was. It is a violent, vicious state that either regains its senses or is going to lose its hold. So this is going to be another reckoning that will come. But I think the way this war will end is the world telling the United States and Israel, stop, it's over, you're wrecking the whole world.